Greetings and welcome back to another session here, TESOL Methods and Materials. Today we're going to continue looking at two of the four major skills here. That's going to be teaching reading and also teaching writing. We'll look again at the research issues, macro and micro, reading difficulties, principles, and then assessing. Let's go right into teaching reading. There's been a lot of research in this field as well as the other three. Some of the research has been dealing with whether we teach top-down or bottom-up processing, which one is more advantageous for learners. The fact is that both of these styles of reading are important when we do reading, when we teach reading. In fact, the brain actually does both at the same time. It's going to be easier to teach one over the other, but there are times where we focus more on top-down versus bottom-up and vice versa. Top-down processing is basically looking at the whole and trying to see what's going on and then try to delve into the details. Bottom-up processing is looking at all the details and trying to build up to the whole. So both of these processes are important. So when we do the teaching of reading, we should encourage students to learn the skills for both top-down processing and bottom-up processing. Another area of research is schema, or background information. The skeleton, the structure of all this background knowledge that students might already have from their own country, from their own language, and from their own studies. Good theorists suggest that we should take advantage of that information when we're teaching reading so that it'll help students to learn faster. There's a lot of information that they have there in that background information. We should try to activate it, use it when we are teaching. Every now and again I got to translate when I was living overseas in Japan, and I would translate from Japanese into English. It was always easier for me to translate when I knew the content of what was being translated. So they would give me a copy and it would be easier for me to translate. Other times I wouldn't receive a copy of what was happening and it was more difficult because I didn't have that background knowledge. Now there were a couple times when I would do translating and it was unexpected, unanticipated, but I knew the overall background information. For example, the topic was linguistics, or the topic was a Bible, and I knew the story, or I knew the concepts that were being covered, so it was easier to translate. That's what schema theory is about. Next, there'll be reading strategies, and there are a number of reading strategies that are out there. There are some who ask this question: should we teach them? Do they help? There are some who believe that learning to read is not something that can be taught. It can only be led. You can lead people to reading. I don't happen to agree with that. I believe that there are things that you can teach. There are some things that you can't teach. It's harder to teach. But the things that you can teach, you should kind of liken it to pointillism, a style of art where they would draw these little dots. Okay, and the dots would eventually create an image, and your eye fills in the rest. With regard to the teaching of language, and here reading in particular, there are little elements that we can teach. Okay, we put in the little dots, and the person, through experience, begins to fill in the rest. And I do believe that it's good that way. So does it help? I would say yes, it does. But this idea of osmosis, simply being in the environment of reading and doing a lot of reading, helps you absorb those skills, and that's also true, but I would think you would want to do both. Another area of research has been extensive reading. Extensive reading is primarily the goal to be doing a lot of reading at the student's level of ability, or just a little higher, not much. There is no focus on grammar, there is no focus on vocabulary, there's focus on enjoyment, to enjoy the reading and to read a lot. And it is believed that through extensive reading you are going to increase a student's language ability. Research has indicated that it does help with regard to reading fluency, reading more quickly, more easily, more fluidly, but it does little to attack issues of vocabulary increasing or grammar understanding. So there is a benefit to extensive reading, and it should be included. It is not a panacea. It is not the end-all and be-all. We know that it's necessary, but it's definitely not sufficient. Other issues, other areas that you should focus on. One is fluency focus. Again, that's one of the reasons why you do extensive reading. But another would be vocabulary focus. In the realm of reading, oftentimes vocabulary and reading do go together because Obviously, you're reading all of these words. Typical academic student coming into the college needs somewhere in the realm of 4,000 to 8,000 words, depending on the area of study that they're going into. Typical language textbooks don't go beyond 3,000, and so there is a wide gap there of a lot of words that their students are going to need to know. There are some very good programs online to have a focus on vocabulary. Obviously, the research with regard to reading tries to encourage the focus of vocabulary within the context of reading. Additionally, there's a cultural focus that researchers have been looking at, and how the culture within the written text of English and the culture within the reading context, the actual reading process, is going to be different, and so we as teachers should focus on those differences as well. There are other elements involved in writing. There is dialect, there is a register that you can focus on, show the differences in the written word, show the differences in the texts that students are reading, and of course there are plenty of digital samples out there. What do readers do when they read? They're primarily encoding ideas that were written down by somebody. I'm sorry, I'm backwards. Words that are written down by somebody, they encode their message in these little squigglies that we call letters. And the reader's job is to decode them, is to reconstruct the code, reconstruct the idea with the code. And that's what reading is all about. You're taking somebody's idea and you're trying to reconstruct it so that you can understand it. And so they're in the job of decoding. That's going to be their primary job. Factors affecting reading. There are any number of factors that affect reading as well beyond the affective filter. There are physical problems that could be a factor. Things like dyslexia that could affect reading. Nearness of language. Nearness of the first language to the second language could be a plus or a minus. Just a great example, if you are a native Chinese speaker and you're trying to learn Japanese, it is much easier to learn to read and write in Chinese because many of the Chinese characters are also used in Japanese. If you're a native English speaker like I am and I try to learn Chinese, it's going to be very difficult because none of the characters that are in Chinese are used in English. So the distance or the proximity to your first language is going to affect your reading. Obviously motivation, and there are other factors also that will affect reading. Some characteristics of reading. One of the things that we need to recognize is that there are many types of writing, from obviously maps to directions to books to articles to actually there are too many to list. The different ways in which we communicate in written form. And obviously, because it's in written form, we have to read them. And so there are all these things that we can, as language teachers, focus on when we're teaching reading. Good writers, when they're writing in a text or whatever, and there's a map or a graph or a picture, they generally refer to it. And it's a help to help the reader understand what something is going on. And so those are things that we want to be able to look at. Now, writing is different from the speaking and listening in a number of ways. One is permanence. When you say something, it's said, it's done, because it's not recorded. Unless, of course, you record it, which most people don't normally do. But it's not recorded, and therefore it's gone. It goes off into the ether. Whereas written materials are more permanent. They stay longer. Also, it gives you more time to process. I've seen research where students were happy to be doing responding to people's comments via a bulletin board because it gave them time to process their thoughts and ideas before they would write them down and send them to the internet. In a live conversation, you don't have that time. You have to respond quickly. So there's more processing time with regard to writing as opposed to speaking. Writing also is more distant, and it's more distant in time, it's more distant in location. I do not need to be with you to read what you have written, and I could be farther away from you in time and in location. Some students are glad to have the distance, other students are frustrated to have the distance. Of course, if the original writer is not around, there's really not much you can do about that. Another difference is the orthography, the way words are written and the way they are contrived so that other meanings can be seen, okay, within it, right? Reading between the lines, as it were. A good writer is going to be able to play with words in order to construe them to mean more than one thing. Now, it's obviously can be done in speaking, but extemporaneous speech gives less opportunity to put those types of things into the text. Whereas with writing, you're going to be able to do that. Also, with regard to orthography, the actual shape of letters, the design and style of a writing, can also have an impact on reading. I know of many students who say I can read block print, but I have great difficulty with cursive writing. Written language is generally more complex. You have more time to put your thoughts into words, and so you have more time to make your sentences more complicated, more intricate. Oftentimes this is done in order to save space so that you become less verbose. And so there's more complex structures that are in written language. Vocabulary as well. Writers tend to use more words that are less common, or tend to use more words that are less common in normal speaking. And it's interesting when you listen to someone who is an avid writer, you listen to how they speak. They don't speak the same way that non-writers speak, because their mind is always within this realm of more complex language, more complex vocabulary. They tend to use those words. So, vocabulary and formality, especially for writers who are writing formal speech and they're doing it often, they tend to take that into their speaking. But writing has more of a formal aspect to it, especially when you're working in particular fields, because you have more time to consider that formality. Different characteristics of writing. What areas can we focus on when we're looking at writing? Again, at the lower levels, we can look at small segments. We can look at words, letters, word functions. We can look at word groupings. When they're reading. We can look at things like clustering. We can look at cohesive devices. Whenever you see a therefore, I always ask, what's that there for? We can look at cohesive devices. We can look at rhetorical modes, whether it's a persuasive paper or it's an informational paper. We can look at the modes. We can look at things like inferring, things that are implied but not spoken. We can detect key points. We can look for specific information. We can distinguish between literal and implied meaning. We can look for metaphors in reading. So there are many things that we can look at when we are looking at reading to try to help students to decipher more effectively. Principles for reading. Please make sure that you find materials that your students like, intrinsically motivated. Offer authentic-based language materials. Try to find things that are real, things that native speakers can use. Now, obviously, when you're dealing at the lower levels, it's more difficult to find appropriate materials, right? Balance with readability materials. There are a number of places where you can get readability materials. There are places online where you can get graded readers. There are places online where you can take a block of text and read it down. Convert it down to a more appropriate level for your students. There are places online that you can do that, and we'll look at those in another lesson. Provide opportunities for reading in class. Now, this one I looked at, I got a yellow flag. Yes, reading is important. Yes, students need to learn about reading, but especially beyond the earlier levels when students learn the strategies for reading and the things that they need to understand. Class time, in my opinion, should be devoted more toward the need for the teacher in the class. Things that students can do outside of class, they should do outside of class. Now, it is also true that there are many students, especially students that are taking language as a foreign language as opposed to a second language, they are less inclined to do their homework. So, to provide opportunity to assist students while they're reading, class time is taken and given to reading in class. I'm not necessarily opposed to that. I would much rather try to motivate students to do this work outside of class, to develop independent learners, and that means that I can focus on materials in class that require me. And that's just me talking here. Practice both intensive and extensive reading. Okay, extensive reading, reading a lot. Intensive reading, where you focus on a smaller block of text so that you can analyze it. Okay, you can analyze the parts of an essay, or the parts of a paragraph, or cohesive devices, or linguistic elements, or lexical ideas. That's intensive reading. And then extensive reading, just get them to read because it's fun to read. Teach both oral and silent reading. I'll never forget the first time I ran across this. I thought to myself, well, who in the world wants to teach oral reading? And then I began to watch students try to produce oral reading, and it was very difficult for them. They learned to decipher, to decode messages as they read in their head, silent reading. But when you asked them to produce sound, to speak what they were reading, it was a very difficult task for them. I realized that students don't have this ability innately, and so it was good for them to practice. And the longer they practiced, the more fluent they became in oral reading. So I would definitely recommend that. Use both top-down and bottom-up processing. And I would stress that you would show your students how to do both of these. Top-down, bottom-up processing I use when I'm studying language often because it helps me to get to the meaning faster. Students that only use one side are probably going to be slower learners. Teach reading strategies, things like skimming, scanning, clustering, guessing the meaning from context. And those strategies I would recommend that you do. And then there are some sample reading activities in Brown's textbook, which again is this book here on pages 376 and following. I'm not going to go through those activities now. I want to move on to assessment here. Ways to assess reading. We can do perceptive reading. Okay, see if students can identify things like words, whether they can copy answers, whether they can read aloud. They can do selective reading. In other words, they're looking for specific information. So you do a comprehension check. You can do a close, etc. Interactive reading, where they give short answers. They do reordering of the story. They can do extensive reading, where they summarize. They respond to an essay. They do notes. They add to the story. They rework the ending of the story, for example. So they're extensive. So there are ways to assess whether someone can read. You can have them summarize. I already mentioned summarizing. All right, let's move on to the last element here, which is teaching writing. Teaching writing is an area that I have enjoyed doing. The research here on second language writing, there is an extensive amount, as is with all these fields. Second language writing has its own journal, several in fact. And so we'll take a look at some of the research. We'll look at the difficulties, the principles, and then again assessing. Let's begin by talking about the dichotomy between composing and writing. There are some in the field who do not believe teachers can teach people to write. Writing is not something that is taught, it is something that is learned. It is something that you do just by being there. If you've ever seen the movie Finding Forrester, have you ever seen this movie, Finding Forrester? It's an excellent film about an old writer and a young writer who meet and they help one another out. But in the middle of the movie, the older writer is trying to show the younger writer how to write, and he tells him, just write, sit down and write, just write whatever comes to your head. And this is this idea of composing. That we can't teach our students to write, that we can only let them compose, as it were. So there's this dichotomy. I probably, again, stand in the middle. I do believe that there are some things that you can teach and there are some things that you cannot teach. I do remember working with students and teaching them the anatomy of a paragraph or the anatomy of an essay, so they could see all the parts and how it was all put together, because of course writing in another language is not the same procedures are not done, the same format is not done. But I had one student who literally in tears, I would try to explain how to create a quote-unquote standard 5-paragraph essay, and I would explain it 5 ways to Sunday. but the student just would not understand. And I realized there's only so much I can teach. I can point in the right direction, I can give examples, I can teach parts, but I can't put it all together as one thing. I cannot teach writing completely. Much of it I can, but parts of it you have to learn just by doing over and over. In like manner, the idea of product versus process. Now, most of the writing teachers that I have met, both in second language and in first language, generally would agree that the writing teacher is supposed to be working on this concept here. It's a process. That you write and revise and revise and write and revise and write. And you do it over and over again. There are others who will look at it as a product, and in truth, it eventually will be a product. It is something that you will hand in to your boss or to your professor, and so in some sense, it is a product. The downside is that young learners think they want to get to the product right away, and they need to learn the process. They need to learn the process of writing and reevaluating and revising and writing again, and that's a process that is important in the writing classroom. So there's this dichotomy. There's also some contrastive rhetoric, which is basically some people's personal background, their schemata may be an issue. Some people whose background is different in terms of how they write. In American English, for example, the writing style is rather direct. The typical writing style is, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to write about, or I'm going to tell you what I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to talk about it, and then I'm going to conclude by telling you what I talked about. Look, for example, at this little presentation that I'm giving you. I begin with, hey, here's a summary of what we're going to talk about, and then I talk about it. It's similar in writing, but other cultures aren't that way. Their culture may cause them to be more vague, or maybe beat around the bush more, and so the writing style is going to be different, and that might be an issue with some students. Okay, authenticity may also play a role. It's an area of research. What type of writing are we doing? Is this real writing, or is this only display writing? Am I only simply showing you what I know and not really writing from myself? And you have teachers, and you have students from all over the place that actually they learn the code, they learn the method for writing, and they just do it. It's not real writing. Another big thing in writing, as in speaking, is feedback. What type of feedback do you give students? How much feedback? Who gives feedback? What type of feedback do you give on grammar, and do you or don't you? Is it better? Comment on grammar is better than praise and questions. I would believe it. I wouldn't believe. I do know that when you're giving constructive criticism, you want to praise your students. You want to encourage them. You want to give criticism, but you don't want to quash motivation. And with regard to grammar, you absolutely want to criticize them on grammar. Show them ways to make things better. And especially if it's a global problem, something I didn't mention earlier when we were talking about speaking. If someone has a speaking or a writing problem and it's global, in other words, they do the same problem over and over and over again, that's something that you want to try to cover. So it's good to have that. Praise does little to help someone become a better writer, and that's your goal. Your goal is to have them be a better writer. So you want to have discussion comments on improving grammar. Another thing you want to do is have research or have comments on any of the other aspects. Give them questions. Give them options, things that they can do to make it better. All right, again, we've talked about writing characteristics before. We're dealing with writing now. It is more permanent. It takes longer to produce. It is more distant. And orthography, complexity, vocabulary, and formality all play a role in writing. One reason why writing is more difficult in some sense than speaking. And speaking, you can say things off the cuff. You can say things in a lighter, less formal manner, especially if you're in a less formal setting. Writing tends to be more difficult to create because of all of the extra rules. Principles for teaching writing. Again, make it motivating. Whatever it is that they're going to be writing about, something should be something that interests them. Oftentimes, one's writing has a corollary, and that's something that they read about or something that they see that is the impetus for their writing. Share with your students what good writers do. This is one of the places, language learning, that I tell students it's very good to steal. If someone has a good way of writing, or they have a good phrase, or they have a good tip in their writing, tell others. Steal that from somebody else. I would always want to share that with my students. Tell them, yeah, if you see a good writing technique that you like, appropriate it. Make it yours. And there's no one person who owns a writing style or a technique. Balance process and product. Again, I would emphasize more of the process, although there will be a product. Emphasize more of the process, because when they leave, they're going to continue to use that process. So it's good for you to help them recognize what it is. Recognize cultural and literacy backgrounds. Recognize that when the students are writing, they're going to have that background. Things may be more difficult for them or difficult to understand because of it. Connect reading and writing, which I've already talked about. Recognize that your students need to be writing to a specific audience. So that audience is going to be reading something, so they should bear that in mind when they're writing something. Provide authentic writing samples. This is an excellent idea, and I'm glad that Brown put it in here, that we ought to provide writing samples to our students so they can get a picture of what's going on. Obviously, this is reading, mind you, but it's a good way to show them what are the parts of a standard writing component, be it a narrative or a poem or whatever. They can see these, they can use this as a model for something that they're going to write. Provide writing samples. Teach them the anatomy of a paper. If you're teaching them how to write a standard essay, teach them the anatomy of a paragraph. Teach them the writing process, which is the standard academic writing process: Brown, organized, draft, brainstorm, organized, draft, revise. Not everybody would agree with that you do it that way. This is more of a mechanical way of doing it. This is more of the teaching writing and not composing component of it. I would still recommend that you do this, only to give your students a guide. I firmly believe that the osmosis style of writing, or the composition style of writing, is very important. We need to be free to express and to write whatever comes to our mind, but at the same time, students who do not have any structure around them because they're learning a new language will benefit from the structure of learning the writing process. Teach them how to respond and how to encourage peer review. Peer review is a great way for students not only to read, but to analyze writing. So you can have a checklist for your students and say, here's a checklist. Do you find the thesis statement or the topic sentence? Have they made good word choices? Do they have cohesive devices? Is there a thesis statement in the paper? That type of thing. You can have them go through that checklist. And then they begin to look for those, as well as include them in their own writing. And again, on pages 405 and following, there are sample writings that Brown has given us. You can take a look at those. Assessing writing. Can I recommend you use a rubric? It's an excellent little tool. You're not just going to give a generic grade, but you can give a grade on content, or organization, or discourse, or surface errors, or word choice, cohesion, or the impact that the writing has. Many different things that you can include in a rubric. What types of writing can you use to be for assessment? One is imitative writing. In other words, they're just copying. They're just spelling. They're just writing the alphabet, right? Okay. Intensive writing, again, is a dictation, or they're going to describe a picture. They're going to create sentences out of vocabulary. It's more intensive. It's not the bigger picture, right? Responsive writing. They'll read something and then they respond. They read something and then they paraphrase or they summarize. Maybe you give them a guided writing. Maybe it's a reader response type of activity. And then extensive writing. There's essay writing. You can write in the modes. You can do a research paper. You can do, for larger things, you could write a script. Depending on the areas that these students at the upper level want to grow. There are any number of ways that you can assess writing at that level as well. Okay, so this and covering all the 4 areas out of the textbook, and looking at each of the sub-skills. For homework, I would like you to continue working on answering your questions in the forum. Continue working on your paper. If you do have any questions or problems about that, please get a hold of me. And we're beginning to run toward the end of the semester, so please make sure that you're also working on your lesson plan. And again, if you have questions regarding any of this homework, let me know. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk to you later.